Olá, sejam todos bem-vindos novamente à Conferência Fulbright 75 anos, os Estados Unidos em Perspectiva. Eu sou Luiz Pedroso, falo em nome da Fulbright Interdisciplinary Network, AFIN. Hoje conosco nós temos o diretor executivo da Comissão Fulbright, Luiz Valcove Loureiro, e o professor James Salzman, que eu apresentarei em breve, junto com sua short bio. A palestra de hoje, conforme nós havíamos anunciado, ela será feita em inglês. As perguntas também poderão ser feitas em inglês, que serão lidas para o professor Salzman ao final da apresentação dele. Eu vou mudar já e fazer essa mesma introdução em inglês também, para o professor Salzman compreender e, a partir dali, darmos andamento à nossa palestra. Thank you very much for everyone joining us today. As I already explained in Portuguese, this lecture will be in English, and I'll just pass the word to Professor Luiz Valcove Loureiro, who is the Executive Director of the Fulbright Commission in Brazil, so he can welcome everyone and briefly talk about the 75th birthday anniversary of the Fulbright program in the world. Professor Loureiro, you have the floor.
No, the virtual floor. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Dr. Salzman, to be here. Thank you, everybody, to join us tonight. I would start saying that 75 years ago, at the time, young politician, a young senator from Arkansas, had this idea in the aftermath of the World War II to do something to promote exchanges so people can better understand each other and avoid avoid wars and conflicts. So it was a very simple concept. It's still very simple, but very, at the same time, very powerful, because it has the potential to develop bridges and to build bridges to develop relationships among people. And we don't see that many programs or initiatives in governments that last so long. And the reason for that is that because the program has a bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, and for this reason, the program resisted I don't know how many administrations, and it's we are very proud of having this tool to promote better relationships among people. 1.5 years ago, we were forced to the pandemic to stop all kind of in-person exchanges, at least sometimes even in our own cities. And you can imagine between countries it would be impossible. And it has been very difficult till a couple of weeks when we see better results deriving from the vaccine, and now we can very cautiously be optimistic about 2022, when we can have the opportunity to leave for some time the screens and have direct contact with people. So this initiative that we have now, this webinars, it was born in this context of the pandemic, and it's offering us opportunity to talk to learn from Dr. Salzman very important things about one key issue of our times. There is the environment and sustainability. That is important to all human beings, for sure. So I do hope you have a wonderful hour with Dr. Salzman, and I expect to see you all in person soon. So I wish you all the best. Thank you, Dr. Salzman, again. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you, Professor Loureiro. Professor Salzman, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll briefly introduce you to our audience. So Professor James Salzman is a Donald Brand Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law with joint appointments at the UCLA School of Law and at the Brand School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. But as I learned out today, Professor Salzman, you are in Harvard right now, correct?
Correct.
Excellent. And also lecturing at Harvard. Professor Salzman has published many books, articles, book chapters, and a broad ranging of scholarship that has addressed topics spanning drinking water, trade and environment conflicts, ownership engineering, and creating markets for ecosystem services. There have been over 100,000 downloads of his articles, and I am certain that there is no better person to talk to us and to follow the mission and talk and present a general overview of the United States participation in COP26 that has recently finished in Glasgow. Professor Salzman, with no further ado, would you so kindly answer us those three questions? What happened, what didn't happen, and what happens next?
I will try. So thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. There are two things in my biography that I need to add to your introduction. The first is that I was a Fulbright scholar for a year in Australia and very much appreciated the opportunity, and I'm happy to give back in a small way for that experience. The second is I've had the great pleasure of visiting Brazil twice. Most recently as a State Department Speakers Bureau speaker, where I toured, I think, 4 or 5 different cities talking about payments for ecosystem services. And I loved my time there. So I'm happy to, if not physically, at least virtually, be with you tonight. So what I thought I'd do for the next 25 minutes or so, 25, 30 minutes, is to really explain to you how we got to where we are with climate change and what to make of the last 2 weeks, which really had the world's attention focused on Scotland and Glasgow in particular. So what I thought I'd do first is give a brief summary of where are we? What are climate treaties? What are climate negotiations? What's the international law on climate? Where did this come from? And very simply, there is a timeline that started in 1992, major events in 1997, 2009, 2015, and most recently in Glasgow. So what I want to do first is just sort of touch on all of those topics so the audience can understand, going into Glasgow, what was at stake and what were the questions that were being asked. So the legal story of climate change starts in 1992. And this was a treaty that was negotiated in Rio de Janeiro at the Earth Summit, which I'm sure many of you are still proud of. That was one of the, probably still the most important international environmental meeting. And what was created was known as a framework convention, because at this time there was no scientific consensus that climate change actually was a real threat. There was great concern, but we didn't know a lot of uncertainty. And so what the framework convention did is essentially did 4 or 5 things. The first is it divided the world into developed and developing nations. Developed were called Annex 1, developing were non-Annex 1. All countries, both developing and developed, agreed that they would measure their greenhouse gas emissions and the inventories, the greenhouse gases that were sucked up by trees and by vegetation. This was important because in the future, if you wanted to set targets, you needed a baseline to set them against. There was vague language to help developing countries with money. There was a vague goal of stabilizing emissions by 1990. The single most important thing that came out of the Framework Convention was an agreement to meet regularly in so-called COPs, Conferences of the Parties. And that's why it's called a Framework Convention. So every time there's a major meeting, it's called a COP. COP26 was in Glasgow. That's the 26th conference of the parties. So the first major COP that takes place is in Kyoto, 1997. And this leads to what become known as the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol adopted what was called a targets and timetables approach. So what it said was that for Annex 1 countries, so developed countries, they agreed to meet certain targets on a certain timetable. So by 2008 to 2012, the United States agreed to reduce its emissions by 5%, the European Union by 7%. Brazil was not an Annex 1 country. They did not have any reduction obligations at all. As part of this, commitment, there was also an agreement that countries could use what were called flexibility mechanisms. This basically was trading back and forth, trading reduced emissions. And the most important of these became known as CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. And the idea here in very simple terms is it allowed Annex 1 countries to trade with developing countries. So for example, if Brazil didn't enter into the CDM, but if they had, then if there had been an afforestation project, sort of increasing forest cover that sequestered a certain amount of carbon, the United States could pay the Brazilian project manager a certain amount of money, and they could use the credits to offset against their emissions. The idea was this will help save the rainforest, that was the hope, and it will give money to developing countries. That was the idea. So 2008, 2012 is approaching. That's the first commitment period, the first period when you can see how nations have done. And people start talking about, well, what's going to happen after that? What's sort of Kyoto 2? What's the successor to the Kyoto Protocol? And so there was something established called the Bali Road Map, 2007, where developing countries say, okay, we'll come on board also, and we'll agree to measurable, verifiable, reportable, nationally appropriate mitigation actions. But there's a deal here. You've got to give us technology, financing, and capacity building. It was a quid pro quo. Developing countries said, we'll take on obligations, but you developed world have to help support us to do that. It's not cost-free. So the world goes into Copenhagen in 2009, and there are all these negotiations back and forth, and the hope is that there's going to be this huge new treaty, and it's a complete disaster, right? Nations can't come together. China says, we're not going to sacrifice economic growth. The US is not able to pass legislation in Congress, and it's a mess. And they get something called the Copenhagen Accord. And two key things here, they say we're going to try to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees, which is hard because there's been no agreement. And they promise that by 2020, we will provide $100 billion per year to developing nations. There's a very real question after Copenhagen whether the United Nations really is the place to negotiate climate at all. That brings us to Paris, the Paris Agreement 2015, and it really is a moment of truth for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the largest international conference ever held in terms of heads of state. 195 heads of state come to Paris. The French were brilliant diplomatically. They were able to get the United States and China 6 months beforehand to make a bilateral agreement saying that they were going to set their own national targets. And so they come into Paris, and there's a total rejection of the Kyoto Protocol approach. No more targets and timetables, no more Annex 1 countries, non-Annex 1 countries. Instead, it's replaced with what becomes known as NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So as Kyoto was top down, Paris is bottom up. Every country will decide for itself, this is what we agree to do that is most appropriate given our economic and social considerations. So Brazil says, this is what we're going to do. The US says, this is what we're going to do. Russia says, this is what we're going to do. The US commits to reduce its greenhouse emissions 26 to 28% by 2025. This is the same goal they'd announced 6 months earlier with China. every 5 years is what's called the stock taking. So in 2023, there's supposed to be a stock taking. How have we done? But in between then, countries can revise their goals. And the hope is to follow what happened with the Montreal Protocol for ozone depletion, which is countries get together regularly and keep getting stricter and stricter. That's the hope. There's also discussion for the first time something called loss and damage. This is a big deal for low-lying island nations that literally may not exist in 20 or 30 years because of sea level rise. And so in the Paris Agreement, the signatory nations say that they will cooperate to address loss and damage. Developing world sees this as money. You're going to help pay us to compensate us for all the harm that's being suffered. But at the same time, in a memo, a separate agreement that accompanies the Paris Agreement, there's a statement that developed nations will have no economic liability. So the Paris Agreement gives, and the memo takes away. So it's on the agenda, but nothing really happens from that. And then in between, there starts being work after Paris over the so-called Paris Rulebook. How do we measure these things? How do we account for these things? If they're carbon markets, what are the rules that are going to operate? So that's all by way of background. So now we go into Glasgow. And Glasgow really is where we see, has Paris done anything? Are we really making progress? Now, I should say it wasn't supposed to be Glasgow. It was supposed to be Italy. And then in Italy in 2020. And then this thing called COVID interrupted everything. And so the UK was supposed to have it next. So COP26, which is the logo for COP26, it basically is done, you can see in the bottom here in small font, in partnership with Italy. So it's really a UK show, but Italy, strictly speaking, should have had responsibility as well. So what happened? Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask Greta Thunberg, what happened is blah, blah, blah. Right? She was not impressed. And I think many of the youth around the world were not impressed. Some good things did happen, but there are reasons to be cautious as well. One thing that happened is that there was more public focus and more civil society engagement than ever before at a COP. Right, so this is just one street scene. There were 100,000 people that demonstrated outside the streets of outside the conference center. It's a lot of people. There's a lot of focus internationally on what was happening. Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, said we're going to focus on coal, cars, cash, and trees. I want to explain in part what he meant by that. So let's start with the emissions, the NDC commitments. So good news, bad news. 151 countries updated their NDCs. It's not clear how serious these were. There was something I call net zero mania. All these countries said we're going to be at net zero by a certain date, 2050, 2070. The question is, how serious are these? Australia had no NDC submitted at all until about a week or less before the actual COP. And they said, okay, we'll be carbon neutral by 2050. No one thinks that this administration, the Morrison, is going to take steps to do that. India says by 2070. Who knows, right? No one in power today is going to be alive in 2070. So it's kind of a long-term goal. The key point is there were very few commitments that were made by 2030. And so this idea of milestones, of goalposts, that's problematic. The other issue is that even if all of these targets that were set were actually met, the best estimate is that would bring us to 2.7 degrees. The goal is to be at 1.5 degrees. So countries are doing better in terms of commitments than they were in Paris, but not nearly good enough to meet the goal of 1.5 degrees. And this has led to something called the production gap. So this is essentially business as usual. This is what you need to do to get to 2 degrees. It is what you need to get to 1.5 degrees. And this is the gap. This is the challenge for international diplomacy. And so the countries agreed next year in 2022 in Cairo at COP27 that they would revisit and strengthen. We'll see, right? That's going to be, in terms of what happens next, that's the first question. Will the countries come back in 2022 with more ambitious NDCs? That's the first sort of moment of truth. There was a major change, though, and this is worth noting. I call it the sectoral pivot. So traditionally, the COPs focused only on carbon dioxide. That changed at Glasgow. In Glasgow, they started focusing on sectoral issues. One of them was methane. Very first time that a COP focused on a non-carbon dioxide gas. And there's something called the Global Methane Pledge, where countries agreed to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So fairly short deadline, and to quantify emissions. This is cutting methane is the single biggest and fastest thing you can do to address climate change, right? They're short-lived gases. You can do a lot to reduce them now. That'll make a difference. The problem, China, India, Russia, and Australia did not sign this. Those are major methane emitters. Will they come on board? That remains to be seen. What about commitments outside the NDCs? And this affects Brazil. So there's something called the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use. So 130 countries, including Brazil, including Indonesia, major forested countries, they agreed to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. There's some money behind this, 12 billion in public funding, 7.2 billion in private funding. Interestingly, especially important for Brazil, $1.7 billion of this is pledged to indigenous communities. It's a lot of money. So that could be a big issue. That said, we've been here before. In 2014, there was something called a New York Declaration on Forests. That also said that they would end deforestation by 2030. The rate has risen since that declaration. So one needs to be, I think, somewhat sober in deciding how to view that. And then there was the joint declaration with China, and this was a surprise. This was not announced beforehand. And they basically talk about cooperation. They're going to cooperate to avoid increased emissions. They're going to cooperate to ban illegal imports of timber. They're going to cooperate to address methane. That's all well and good. I think on the one hand, that's quite promising because relations between the US and China are quite fraught at the moment. So it's good to see they're cooperating on something, but it's very vague what this actually means. It's basically an agreement to agree that we'll come together and talk. So that remains to be seen. The biggest action, I think, was toward fossil fuels. So there was a commitment by 30 different countries and importantly, financial institutions to halt all financing for fossil fuel development projects overseas. That could be a big issue, right? There are a lot of subsidies that go to fossil fuels overseas. It's important to note that there are far more subsidies that go to fossil fuels domestically, and there was no agreement on that. But this is the first time fossil fuels have been identified, and more specifically, this got a lot of press coverage. There was an agreement, there was text in the agreement that was basically shared with the plenary just before the gavel was supposed to come down and end the session that said that there would be accelerated efforts in phasing out unabated coal power. That means coal power that does not have carbon capture associated with it and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. India and China at the last minute said they would not accept the term phase out. And so it was replaced with the phrase phase down. Alok Sharma, who is the British president of the COP, this is a picture of him. It was kind of a shock that this happened. And he said to the plenary he was deeply sorry this had happened. India and China didn't apologize. They said, we're developing countries, we need coal. We're not ready to phase them out. We're willing to phase down, but we're not willing to phase them out. Loss and damage. This had been raised at the 2015 Paris Agreement, and there was real hope that this would lead to some real money. There had been there was something called the Warsaw Mechanism to try to work toward this, something called the Santiago Network to work toward this. Neither of those have been well funded. What the developing countries pushed for in Glasgow was something called the Glasgow Loss and Damage Facility that would actually channel money. And developed countries basically said no. And so all it's going to be is a dialogue. And this was really harshly denounced by developing countries. This is a photo that went viral around the world. This was the Prime Minister of Tuvalu basically giving a press conference in the ocean because he's saying this is what's happening to our country. We're basically being submerged. Despite that, no progress on this. Finance, money talks. So there had been, as I said, there had been a commitment in Paris to have, actually in Copenhagen and then Paris, to be providing $100 billion per year to developing countries for climate change. Only $79.8 billion had been provided as of last count. So the $20 billion finance gap. There was an agreement in Glasgow that $100 billion per year will be provided by 2025, and at least $40 billion of that will be for adaptation, a doubling of what's currently provided. One of the, it's a little more technical. One of the big issues is, should these be grants? Many of these are loans. And so it's not free money. And so that's an issue as well. And then finally, I'm not going to get into detail on this because this is rather technical, but this is an issue in terms of carbon markets. And Brazil has been very active in this space. So Brazil basically was arguing that they wanted the ability to double count. So if they basically had, let's say they planted a lot of trees or increased forest cover, they get credits for sequestering carbon. They want to sell that. They were saying initially, we get credit toward our NDC and the country we sell it to gets credit toward their NDC. I'm oversimplifying, but that was the basic idea. There was agreement not to do that. So double counting is no longer allowed. What to do with the credits that exist in the Clean Development Mechanism, that was addressed. And they basically said, we're going to go forward with international markets. And there's be a tax on basically offset sales between countries in an international market, and a certain amount of that will go to countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. So let me bring this to a close. I'm asked, is the glass half empty? Is the glass half full? So half full. There clearly, more so than any previous COP, was an acknowledgement that there is a climate crisis. Right. The text itself laments the fact that we need to get to 1.5 degrees, and that's not the target that we're on right now. There was massive international focus on this meeting, much more so than ever before. There was an understanding that you have to break up the climate issue into bite-sized sectoral approaches. So that was a positive. Focus on methane. There may be a methane convention coming. I wouldn't be surprised to see that in terms of what's happening next. There was an emphasis that we have to pay for adaptation. It can't be enough just to focus on reducing emissions. We have to pay to adapt, to put in seawalls, to relocate, all these issues. And there were rules that were set for trading. That's all good. Not so good is the fact that even after signing, even after agreeing to phase down coal instead of phase out coal, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, comes home and says, we're going to increase coal production because that's our economy. We have to do this. China increases coal dramatically because they've got an energy crunch right now. In the US, coal is at a 12-year high. And so they're digging more coal too. I can only assume the same is true in Brazil right now also. There's sort of a global energy crunch that's going on right now. Much of what was agreed to in Glasgow is deciding things a bit later. And the phrase we use in English, I assume you have a Portuguese equivalent, is kicking the can down the road. I don't know, Luis, if that's exactly the same phrase or not, but you understand the metaphor, right? You're basically pushing it off. That's okay if you actually are going to address it down the road. It's not okay if you're going to kick it again once you get to it. And that, I think, is the great question. And so the president of the COP, Alok Sharma, said, 1.5 degrees is still within reach, but its pulse is weak. Now he's mixing metaphors there. Is it within reach, or is it a dead body, a dying body? But you get the point, right? He's basically saying, we didn't do as much as we could, but we did something. And so, when people ask me, is the glass half empty? Is it half full? I push back. I think that's the wrong metaphor, right? No COP, no single COP, whether it's Paris or Copenhagen or Glasgow or Cairo or Rio, no COP is going to solve the climate crisis. This is something that we will continue to face, my generation, your generation, the next generation after that. This is a long-term problem. And so half empty, half full, we're not going to solve it. The key point in my view is, are we moving in the right direction? I think the better metaphor is a marathon or a relay race. This is a long-term project. And so the question really is, to my mind, are we moving in the right direction? I think the answer to that is yes. But one also has to follow it up. Are we moving fast enough before we start seeing more and more bad outcomes, like the Amazon burning, like drought? That's a fair question. And I think that there are a lot of people who, for good reason, say, no, we've got to move faster. So, was COP26 a good thing to do? Was it a good event? Yes. Countries are saying the right thing. They're pledging the right things. The question is, are they going to live up to that? And, we'll start seeing it at COP27 in Cairo. But hopefully this should give you and the folks who are watching tonight a sense of sort of where the state of play is and what to look for as this continues. So that's my 30 minutes. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. It was very enlightening. I say for myself, and I believe that I am saying for everyone else. And something that while you were talking, and I'll just make the first question, and then I'll have a couple of questions already written and asked by the audience, is that the United States has shifted its approach to climate change and its diplomacy towards climate change. And arguably, the figure of John Kerry has a good representation on that. How do you see his performance, I'll just say performance, during the COP26?
Yeah, so let me actually answer that. And it's a good question. Let me answer in a broader context. United States leadership on climate is essential, right? China is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases. It surpassed the US about 10 years ago, but US is #2. We emit a lot of greenhouse gases, and historically, we've emitted the most greenhouse gases. So we have a responsibility to try to, address the problem that we have largely played a role in causing. One of the things that's made it difficult for the rest of the world is the United States has whipsawed back and forth. So the Clinton administration signs the Kyoto Protocol. The Bush administration pulls us out of the Kyoto Protocol. The Obama administration signs the Paris Agreement. The Trump administration pulls us out of the Paris Agreement. Biden administration pushes back in the Paris Agreement. It's hard for the rest of the world to say, full steam ahead when the US is flipping back and forth. So that's a problem. That's a problem. And the problem is the United States, climate change has become, I think, very unfortunately, a partisan issue. It shouldn't be, right? Democrats and Republicans should be concerned about the effects of climate change. And yet that it seems to be politically not like that, right? So that's a problem. And if Biden wins the next election, assuming he runs, there will be more continuity. If he loses and a Republican becomes president, I fear there's going to be another flip. So that's a concern, just in terms of continuity. You asked about John Kerry. I think Kerry played a very important role. I mean, he is a high status individual. He was the Secretary of State, right? That's a big deal. And he's very experienced. He basically, was very active when the Paris Agreement was negotiated. So he understands the diplomatic terrain. He said, he's not the first person to say this, but he said, diplomacy is the art of the possible, not the art of the perfect. And so, when India and China at the literally last minute said, we do not accept phase out coal, we only accept phase down coal, Kerry spoke in favor of that. It's not what he wanted, but if you're going to have an agreement, you've got to have India on board. You've got to have China on board. If Brazil had said that, you've got to have Brazil on board. These are major countries when it comes to addressing climate change. And so to a certain extent, what I teach about when I talk to my students is an idea of the lowest common denominator. Right? What is the lowest you can go and still move forward? Now, frankly, Saudi Arabia would have an even lower level if they could, but they're not significant enough that they can sort of push the entire plenary one way or another. China can, India can, Brazil probably can, US can. There are major countries that have to be brought on board. And I thought Kerry was quite skillful. He was also, I think, very skillful working with the Chinese. As I said earlier, US and China are having a lot of policy conflicts at the moment. South China Sea, trade. These are big issues, and they have the countries have different views. The fact that they could come together and reach an agreement, even if the agreement, frankly, is not very ambitious, that's a good thing.
Fantastic, fantastic. And just getting the China idea on, we have a question from Larissa Novo, which actually is a Fulbrighter in the US pursuing her PhD right now. She asks, what are the major factors interfering on China compromising in these agreements? Are they more political, or because it's really difficult to do that being a developing country?
I think it's both, right? They're related. I mean, China has become vastly wealthier in the last 2 decades, but a large part of their population is very poor. So, China, it's kind of it's a schizophrenic country in the sense that they've got some very wealthy populations and some very poor populations. So poverty alleviation is still a major concern, and rightly so, for the Chinese government. They also have vast reserves of coal. That's so you can see why they're concerned about simply moving away from fossil fuels. At the same time, they're the world's largest emitter. And so for climate change, I think it's very much the case that as goes China, so goes the world. If China cannot be persuaded to not simply reduce its rate of increase, but to actually reduce its overall emissions, then I think that we're going to see a lot more climate change going forward. And so the question then becomes, what type of situation would need to occur for China to say, okay, we're going to move aggressively toward reduced emissions. Part of it is technological, right? China has become a world leader in solar power. They've become a world leader in wind power. But if you look at that, at the production of renewable energy in China, actually in almost any country, except maybe Denmark, but if you look, the US is the same, the vast majority of fuel consumption, or fuel production, I should say, is fossil fuels. US is about 70-75% fossil fuels. China's even more. So if you're going to shift away from that, that's going to take decades. It's not something that's going to happen very quickly. And China, I think, finds itself in somewhat of a bind. So, as some of the listeners may know, there have been power blackouts recently in China because of supply chain issues. And so that's why I showed the headline. Basically, China is, dramatically increasing the amount of their coal. They have been producing domestically, building domestically new power plants, coal-fired power plants. That's problematic. Those plants have a lifetime of 30, 40, 50 years. And so I think, in terms of China, and I think in terms of the US, frankly, you have to look at, what are they doing, not what are they saying. If they are increasing coal production, that's concerning. If they are building more coal-fired power plants, that's concerning. And I don't mean to beat up on China. I think that's true. That's true for any country. China is particularly important because they've become such a large part of the overall fossil fuel combustion picture.
Fantastic, and sharing my views as well. That's exactly what I think. It's a pressing issue for us, I think, for the whole world, and the COP26 has just shown that. As you mentioned, there is this acknowledgement of a climate crisis, but developing countries like Brazil need the financial support, and the 100 million that did not come, and many other initiatives that are to be seen. Those make the difference. Those can make a huge difference for us. Yeah. Professor Salzman, once again, thank you very, very much for joining us in this conference. Not the COP conference, but the Fulbright anniversary conference that we are very proudly hosting this week. Also, that it is the International Education Week, which is very important due to the work that the Fulbright Commission and the Fulbright program does throughout the world. You more than anyone as a Fulbrighter know that. And I hope I can see you in Brazil sometime very soon.
I hope so. I
And
hope so. No, I want to thank you. It's a great honor to be part of this. Obrigado. And I hope we can actually meet in person at some point.
We'll definitely try to make that work. Muito obrigado, professor. Uma ótima noite a todos que nos acompanharam também até aqui. Uma ótima noite. E amanhã temos 3 novas palestras para encerrar o nosso evento. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, everyone.